How's it going, everybody? This is Jeremy Hoover with Commander Quantified, here with our first episode, Quantified Theory. We're going to be talking through card draw and how that works in your deck, as well as exactly what does it mean to quantify card draw. How do we give all of this an actual number? Some examples in the front here will give you a little bit of a spoiler, a teaser, if you will, on how we're going to move forward with it. So first up, we're going to be talking about what exactly is card draw, and it really breaks down to exactly one question. Are you net positive on cards after you activate the ability or cast the spell? So if you aren't net positive, which means you do not have additional play options after you do it, it's not card draw. Pretty cut and dry, pretty simple. If you do, it then is card draw. But then we have to go into the question of like what type of card draw it is. Again, a lot of credit to Command Zone on this. They started off a lot of the terminology for me here, so I don't have to come up with it myself. So we're just going to talk about repeatable first. So repeatable nets you one or more cards each time it's triggered. So usually it's going to be a triggered ability or an activated ability, something that you can do on a consistent basis over the course of the game rather than just one time. We also have burst card draw, which is it nets you one or more cards once. So a couple of examples of this are going to be things like Return of the Wild Speaker, Knight's Whisper. Some of your impulse draw also counts as burst draw. We'll talk about that in a second. Then we also have insight, which is going to be the ones that give you access to the top cards of your library. So future sight is actually what this particular one is named after. This is my terminology for it. You can use something different if you want, but for now we're going to call it insight draw. And then our last one is impulse draw. It's that primarily red one that says, hey, you're going to exile cards from the top of your library and you'll have access to them for a certain time period. And that is going to be all of your impulse draw. There's a couple of instances where it is mixed, but mostly going to be in red. So let's start off with repeatable card draw. And there are a couple of questions we need to ask ourselves when we're talking about repeatable card draw. The first of which is how many times per turn cycle is this going to trigger or going to draw me cards? And I have some specific examples here, so let's go with Sylvan Library first. Sylvan Library is going to be a 1 and a green enchantment that says at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. You basically put them back or pay 4 life for each one beyond the first. So how many times does Sylvan Library happen? Exactly once. So once on your turn specifically, right? And that's going to be the first category. The second category is Valakut Exploration was one of the better options for that. It is a landfall enchantment, 2 and a red. And it's going to say landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you are going to exile the top card of your library until the end of turn. You can play that card. And at the beginning of your end step, basically you take all those cards that you've exiled and you put them in your graveyard, deals 1 damage to each opponent for each of those. So this can happen multiple times, but it's only on really your turn, right? Because you're not going to be playing a lot of stuff on your opponent's turns off of Valakut Exploration, most likely. The only way you would be able to do that is if you're somehow, if you're cracking a fetch or something like that on an opponent's turn. It's an out, but it's not like the best use of the card, probably. We'll move forward to Morbid Opportunist, newer one from Midnight Hunt. Really like this one. It is 2 and a black for a creature human rogue, a 1/3. It says whenever a creature dies, then you get to draw a card, but you only get to do that once each turn. So notice that it is not once on each of your turns, it is once each turn. So it can trigger 1 time for each person at the table. And then we're going to go to our last one, which is the Big Bad Rhystic Study, 2 and a blue enchantment. Says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you get to draw a card unless they pay a colorless mana. Or 1 mana of any color. So This one triggers usually multiple times on each opponent's turn. So you're going to count the number of opponents you have, and it's going to give you points according to that. So how do we quantify these repeatable card draw cards? Well, one more question real quick before we actually get in, right? And the second question that we have to ask for repeatable is how many cards do you get for each trigger? So here's a few examples. Basically, you're looking at, it usually creates 1 or 2 card draws per trigger. Some pretty popular cards here. You've got Guardian Project, Esper Sentinel, Consecrated Sphinx, and then there's this one, Eruth, Tormented Prophet, 1 blue-red that actually exiles 2 when you would normally draw 1. So it does give you access to 2 at that point. It's kind of interesting because that really nets you 1 card, but you're drawing 2, right? So when you're looking at these, the cards per trigger does matter. So how many times does it trigger per turn cycle? How many cards do you get per trigger? Those are things that you have to look at when you're trying to quantify your card draw. And I'll give an exact formula for that during our next episode. So let's move on to burst card draw. I've got this little graphic over here that's just a bell curve because we're going to kind of talk about where card draw lands makes a difference on when it's good. So we're going to ask the question of burst card draw. If I cast this on turn 6, how many cards does it draw? The reason we choose turn 6 on this is because if you look at kind of your different zones of play, right? You have turns 1 to 3, you develop your engines. You do things like play your 2-drop mana rocks. You play your repeatable card draw early on in the game. But later on in the game, you want to cast burst draw, and it's probably not going to do you any more good on turn 10 than it is on turn 6. So turns 4 to 6, usually you're amassing your forces. You're playing out your threats, you're getting together your combo pieces, and you are trying to basically get yourself in a position where you can end the game. And then turn 7 and forward, you're executing your win conditions. Players are stopping you. But generally, we're going to assess burst card draw as though it were cast on turn 6. It really doesn't do you any good before that, and it doesn't do you any more good after that, from what I can tell of our burst card draw. So, how many cards does it draw on turn 6? We've got Commune with Lava. Over here, it's X red. Red is an instant. Exile the top X cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. So there are some pretty important words on there. We were talking about play, right? Play is important rather than cast because you can get lands off of that. But on turn 6, we're going to assume that based on a regular game, you have ramped 2 times. So you have 8 mana available. If you pour it all into Commune with Lava, you are getting 6. So up to 6 at most. That's how many cards it's going to draw. Because moving forward, we're going to talk about like some different ways that that is going to help you out in the long game. Because you can do up to, right? So we're going to assess each card as though it were played at its maximum potential. Knight's Whisper is going to be 1 and a black for a sorcery. You draw 2 cards, lose 2 life. Very simple card. There are a lot of these. You're going to draw exactly 2. No matter when you play it, it's going to be the same. And then you've got Shamanic Revelation, which is 3 green, sorcery, draw a card for each creature you control, has Ferocious, which is you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So generally, when you are running something like Shamanic Revelation, you are running cards like Mana Dorks and 2-drop creature ramp and stuff like that. If you are not creature heavy, you probably shouldn't be running this card as your draw. So we're going to say that 6 to 8 is how many you're going to have out. As far as creatures at this time, we're going to just address it as 7, I believe. just because that's kind of going to be a good average for that. So we can kind of use the law of averages, get a number crunch out of it, right? Let's move on to Insight card draw. So that is the top card of your library. So what we have to ask ourselves for Insight card draw is how many card types does it access? What percentage of cards in the deck is it going to be able to hit? So if you are going to do that, what are the, let's just get right into it. So Bolas's Citadel, 3 and 3 black, legendary artifact. You may play the top card of your library, but if you play it, you pay life equal to its mana cost. So that in particular hits everything, right? The only thing that really stops you is if you've already made a land drop, you cannot play a second land, which is why Sensei's Divining Top is the combo piece with this. You put Sensei's Divining Top in the place of the land, and then you can just play Sensei's Divining Top again, continue endlessly. And then you've got Augur of Autumn, newer card again from Midnight Hunt. Love that set. Doing great. 1 green, human druid. You may cast the top card of your you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Same rules, you still have to have a land drop available. And then it has Coven, so if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you're going to be able to also cast creatures from the top of your library. That is a pretty big deal. That's 2 different card types. You are going to be able to hit most of your deck as long as you have Coven turned on. I really like this in my Tanazir deck. Basically, it hits 75% of the cards in the deck will be able to be playable with Augur of Autumn. Experimental Frenzy, 3 and a red, same thing. You can look at the top card of your library at any time. You can play the top card of your library, but you can't play cards from your hand. You can play 3 and a red and actually destroy it so that you can play cards from your hand again. This is kind of a less than ideal option for your Insight draw, but if you are locked into mono red or you're playing kind of a storm build, this is a good way to go. Bergie in particular loves this card because it's just going to continue to go off. Then you have Verge Rangers, 2 and a white, a human scout, first strike 3/3. You can look at the top card of your library at any time. Pretty common line on all of these, by the way. And you can play the top card of your library if it's a land and your opponent controls more lands than you do. So not as powerful as the other options. Real big surprise there. But you know what? White needs to make its land drops too, and this is a way to do it. So it is card draw in white. And then you've got Future Sight, which is what Insight came from, and that can play any type. Same thing. You can look at the top card of your library, but you play with it revealed, which is kind of a downside. It's a Prophet of Crufix problem. Courser of Crufix problem. And then you may play the top card of your library. So that, again, hits every permanent type. You can play them off the top. There are other cards like this. Mystic Forge plays artifacts off the top. Reality Chip is a new one that plays off the top. Really like that card, by the way. It can absolutely be competitive because it acts like a Mystic Forge after it's equipped if you're running an artifact deck. Anyway, that aside, continuing on. So the second question you have to ask with Insight card draw, and this is actually kind of a subset of Insight, is like the sneak attack effects. So like your Winota is a good example of it. Here are 3 others that are just pretty good. Basically, you're going to be looking through the top cards of your deck: Gisha, Sun's Avatar, Muxus, Goblin Grenadier, and Emerith the Lustrous. All cards that are looking at the top, grabbing stuff, putting it into play. Those are just like really good ones. Emerith, I guess, just puts it in your hand, not into play. But it is a really good Insight card draw, because if you're playing something like Artifacts and you somehow manage to generate, like if you throw out Psymaster Thopterist, every time you play an artifact, you get a Thopter, and the Thopter enters the battlefield, you look at the top card, you get the next artifact, and you can just kind of chain those together. Really great synergy there. So let's move on to impulse. So impulse draw, we talked about being primarily a red thing. Still is, not going to go back on that. But the questions you have to ask are how many turns are the cards accessible for, and are they cast or play? So as far as how many turns are the cards accessible, there are two different wordings that really come in on impulse draw, and it's the end of your turn, or the end of your next turn, or this turn. And then can you cast something or play it? Again, we were talking about play being able to hit lands, cast only being able to hit spells. So that's going to be a pretty significant difference there. So here's some options of different cards that are this turn. You'll notice most of them are going to be like something that you get for free if it's a consistent one. So like a great example, the Lelia, just whenever it attacks, it does it, so it doesn't cost mana each time to do it. And so you can kind of like continuously go through it. So that kind of goes into the overlap, right, that we were talking about between impulse draw and recurring draw. Same thing with Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. There isn't a lot of stuff like that in red. Go over to the other side. It's the end of your next turn. So Brea's Apprentice is a new favorite of mine. Basically, you sack an artifact, exile a top card. You can play it until the end of your next turn. Activate that on your opponent's end step or something like that. If you happen to have like a Clock of Omens or something, it just kind of untaps and goes crazy. Pretty cool that way. Like it. So Impulse Draw, good, not great. So let's talk about card draw placement. So what mana cost does your card draw need to be in order to make it work for you? In decks where you have stuff, mana dorks, like an Elvish Mystic, which just tap for a green mana, and they're a 1 cost, you probably want to be gearing yourself toward 3 or lower drop card draw engines, right? Or anything that's like an odd cost, because you're starting your curve out on 1, you're planning to move to 3, and my guess is you're probably planning to move to 5. And after that, it's kind of like a snowball effect. So if you're playing something like an Elvish Mystic or an Elves of Deep Shadow would be a really good example for this card, we are going to introduce the Phyrexian Arena. So on turn 1, you play Elvish Mystic. You're starting to develop your engine, and then you play Phyrexian Arena to start developing your card draw engine, or maybe Sylvan Library and an extra mana elf or something like that. Basically, you want to use all your mana, and you want to set up a actual engine before the game gets really going on turn 4. So if you want to do that, just consider where your ramp is placed, and you want it to fit with your card draw. On this same note, Arcane Signet, if you're playing kind of a more aggressive deck, or something like an Artifacts deck would be a good example for this. Arcane Signet's 2 mana. You go from 2 to 4, and you play Bident of Thassa. So whenever a creature deals combat damage, you get to draw a card. And that is significantly more powerful for 1 more mana than Phyrexian Arena, because if you get in with 2 creatures each turn, it has net you 1 additional card each turn for basically 1 more mana, and it's on curve, right? So you want to continue going that direction. So here we have a graphic that I put together. Just the types of card draw you want for each different archetype, aggressive, mid-range, and control. It has been said, but I would kind of argue against that Commander is just different flavors of mid-range. In higher tiers, like your what would normally be considered like 7s and 8s, you're going to see both aggro and control strategies. And there are different card draw types that are more suited to each of those strategies. So I just thought I'd come up with a little bit of a graphic, and feel free to give your input on this. Let's move forward with aggressive first. So repeatable in aggro. I would say you want 2 or less repeatable card draw pieces. So if you are looking at repeatable. What you really want to be doing in the early turns of aggressive decks is deploying. So you want to be the first to deploy your creatures so that you can actually start getting in hits as early as humanly possible, or goblinly possible, I guess, if you like goblins. Shout out to Chris for Krenko. And the repeatable card draw doesn't really work that well for this. So what I would really suggest is that you do 6 to 8 burst card draw. So I play a Tanazir deck that I really enjoy and will be using for the example for aggro as how you would best accomplish that. It usually wins the game by turn 5 or 6, and the reason that it can do that is because what I do is a ton of burst card draw. Tanazir himself just buffs everybody, but when we're talking about burst, you are playing 3 or 4 creatures as early as turn 3, and what you can do with that is say, okay, well, I'm going to draw a card for each creature I control and refill my hand completely. Where repeatable, usually you're getting like 1 to 2 cards maybe, rather than 4 to 5. Even Windfall is a great example of a great card for burst in an aggro strategy. Because what you're going to have an empty hand, and somebody else is going to be sitting over there with 7 cards, and you're going to refill to 7, and they're going to be stuck with a different 7 than they had. So burst card draw, top pick for aggressive strategies. Insight draw, 2 or less. I play Augur of Autumn only because it hits 75% of my Tanazir deck, because you're talking about 34 lands and 40 plus creatures. So that really does do a lot when you're playing like a Mana Dork, Augur of Autumn, Tanazir. That's 3 different powers right there, so Coven is immediately activated. When it comes to Impulse Draw, though, I would say 4 or less. The reason I say 4 is because red does do a lot of aggressive strategies, and it's sometimes the only option that you have that is kind of burst card draw-esque. So if you have the option, I would say burst over impulse. If you don't, impulse is a good secondary. So that would be it for aggro. Run your burst card draw. That's what I'm telling you right now. If you're trying to win early, if you're trying to go fast, that's how you do it. Your mid-ranges, though, you want to actually be, funny enough, in the middle of the range. So your repeatable card draw, you want 3 to 4. You want to be able to consistently answer that aggro deck, and you want to be able to keep up with the control deck, which the control deck is going to be running probably more card draw than you. So you want more card draw than, or you want to try and keep up with the control deck while not losing to the aggro deck. So that's why you would also run probably 3 burst card draw effects. I say 2 to 3. And you want them to be kind of medium-sized as well, right? You don't want to run something that's like probably a Sphinx's Revelation, because you don't want the game to go that long. You want to be able to get the control player out as soon as possible. So less burst card draw effects, more repeatable ones. And then you look at insight draw, I would say it's 4 or less. You can definitely increase the amount on this, because when you're talking about insight draw, it's being able to just constantly have access to an extra card. It's kind of similar to repeatable. Repeatable is probably the preference if you have to choose between the two, because insight draw will give access to something that nobody else really knows usually, unless you're like play with the top card of your library revealed on the insight draw. And then we can look at impulse draw, just a few, not a lot. Preferably if you have like repeatable impulse draw, that would be good. So that would be, yeah, 2 or less would be the correct number for something like that. As we move over into control from mid-range, you're going to notice kind of a pattern here. I would say 5 to 6 repeatable. The consistency that you want is going to be high. You probably aren't going to be playing very many end-game threats, but you want to be able to answer everything. So being able to have repeatable sources of card draw is far more important in a control deck. Burst, I would say 3 to 4. You just want more of that. Again, same thing. Like, just being able to... You will probably not be ahead for most of the game if you are playing control, but you are trying to keep the game at parity, so like have everybody be on an equal playing ground for as long as possible, and then move ahead when they run out of resources. That is the goal of a control deck. So you need more card draw, regardless of the type, than the other two archetypes. Insight, I would say 4 or less, kind of same thing as mid-range. We talked about that already. And then Impulse, same thing, 2 or less. The only thing you'd really want in a control deck that's Impulse draw is if it's somehow connected to a win condition. Like if you were going to play... no, I can't really think of it. So yeah, I would say like less impulse draw in a control strategy. So this gives you kind of an idea of what we're looking at. Card draw by strategy. This is not something that I've seen anywhere else, so hopefully this is helpful to you. Yeah, try it out, run it, tell me if I'm wrong. Happy to reorganize things. And lastly, we're just going to do a quick overview here and kind of a look at what our next steps are. So in the overview, we're just going to say we have 3 questions. What turn am I going to cast my card draw? Because that's a really important question. That's going to tell you where it lands on your curve, how many cards you're going to draw off of it, what's the ideal scenario for this card when you're looking at card draw. How many cards does it draw? Just absolute quantity. Does matter a lot if you're drawing 5 cards off of it. If you're planning on the game going, 8 turns, your Sylvan Library could draw up to, let's see, 2 times 8, so that's 16 cards. But that's only if you cast it on turn 2. So assuming ideal scenarios, like how many cards does it draw? And then third is how often does it draw them? Is it once per turn? Is it once on each turn? Or is it like multiple times per turn? That will help you quantify what your deck is going to do. So as we consider these questions, we're going to move forward and going to have our next episode be with a guest. And we're going to be looking at our favorite card draw cards and giving them actual factual numbers based on all of these different questions. So hopefully we can give you answers to those questions during the next episode. Hoping to write an article within the next week here and get it out to you. Just regarding how the metric works for card draw. Maybe even give a formula if you're interested in that. Fellow Quandrix people will really enjoy that. And until then, I'll see you soon.